The billionaire CEO made him a shocking deal. Bring this painting back to life, and I'll be yours. What the janitor father did next left her, and everyone else, speechless. The Hudson estate stood like a silent monument to wealth and power, its tall gates and sweeping drive announcing to the world that this was not a home, but a fortress of influence. Inside, beneath crystal chandeliers and across polished marble floors, a woman in a crisp white suit walked with the confidence of someone who owned every inch of the space. Claire Hudson had been called many things: visionary, tycoon, shark, even genius. But none of those words touched the hollow place in her chest that no amount of success or money could fill. Every evening, when the meetings ended and the calls were silenced, she found herself drawn to a single room at the end of a long hallway. It was quiet, almost sacred, and at its center stood the ruined remains of a painting that once defined her childhood. The frame was warped from fire, the edges brittle with ash. What had once been a portrait of her father, Robert Hudson, a man whose smile had been her anchor, was now a blur of melted pigment and sorrow. She would stand there for hours, fingertips grazing the charred surface, as if sheer willpower could restore it. Claire was known for her unshakable composure in boardrooms and negotiations, but here she let the mask fall away. The painting was the last tangible link to the man who had taught her everything: discipline, ambition, the strength to lead. His sudden death had broken her in ways she could never admit to anyone. On this particular evening, she wasn't alone. Across the room, unnoticed at first, Daniel Morris moved quietly with a mop in his hand. The mansion had recently hired him, another nameless employee in a long line of staff that came and went, cleaning what needed to be cleaned, invisible to the woman who lived above them. He was a man of sturdy build, his dark hair slightly unkempt, his eyes carrying the weight of exhaustion, but also something deeper, an endurance, a kind of quiet dignity. For Daniel, the job wasn't about survival for himself, it was about his daughter, Emma. Every shift meant food on the table, clothes for school, a future he desperately wanted for her. Claire finally noticed him when he paused, glancing up at the ruined painting. For the briefest second, she hated that a stranger could witness her standing so vulnerable in front of it. She cleared her throat, trying to mask the tremor in her voice. "Do you know what this is?" she asked suddenly, her tone sharper than she intended. Daniel, caught off guard, looked at the canvas and then back at her. "I know what it was," he said softly. His answer startled her. There was no mockery, no pity, just understanding. Something unexplainable stirred inside her then, a reckless impulse born of loneliness and grief. She turned to him fully, her brown eyes burning with a mixture of challenge and desperation. "If you can bring this painting back to life," she said, each word measured, "then I'll let you steal me." The silence that followed felt endless. Claire's heart pounded as she realized what she had just confessed. Not a real promise, but a test, a wall thrown up to see if anyone dared to climb it. Daniel stood still, gripping the handle of the mop. A flicker of surprise crossed his face. Then something else. Curiosity, maybe even resolve. He could have laughed it off, ignored it, pretended he hadn't heard. But instead, he gave her the kind of look that didn't flinch before her wealth or her status. It was the look of a man who had lost things too, who understood brokenness in a way the rich and powerful rarely imagined. Claire turned back to the canvas quickly, afraid of her own words, but the air between them had already shifted. The mansion's grand hall, usually so sterile and cold, suddenly felt charged with something new, an unspoken beginning neither of them had expected. And as Daniel returned to his work, his mind already drifting to possibilities he never thought he'd consider, Claire felt the weight of her father's gaze from the ruined canvas, as if even in its destruction, the painting had found a way to weave two lost souls into its story. The next morning, the Hudson estate awakened with its usual rhythm of footsteps, murmurs of staff, and the faint hum of polished machinery in the background. Claire, however, found herself lingering in her office longer than usual, staring at a stack of contracts she could recite by memory. Her mind wasn't on the mergers or the forecasts, it was still trapped in the echo of her own reckless words from the night before. "If you can bring this painting back to life, I'll let you steal me." The sentence replayed over and over, an absurd challenge from a woman who never let her guard down. She had built empires on precision, yet in that moment she had revealed a fracture. What unsettled her most wasn't that she had said it. It was the memory of Daniel's eyes, steady and unshaken, as if he hadn't dismissed her madness. Daniel, meanwhile, finished his morning shift in silence. Cleaning a mansion like Hudson's was unlike any other job. Every corner gleamed, every surface demanded perfection. Yet as he moved through corridors lined with oil paintings and marble busts, his thoughts kept circling back to the ruined portrait in the hall. He hadn't lied when he said he knew what it once was. As a boy, his mother had dragged him through museums, insisting that art could hold life itself if one looked close enough. He hadn't understood then, but when he saw Claire's face, its armor cracking as she stood before her father's portrait, he recognized that same truth. Art wasn't paint or canvas. It was memory. It was love. It was the ghosts of people who refused to be forgotten. After his shift, Daniel returned to the small apartment he shared with his daughter. Emma greeted him at the door with her usual grin, her dark hair falling in her eyes. She was only 10, but she carried herself with a maturity that worried him sometimes. "You're late," she teased, handing him a plate of toast she had burned slightly. Daniel ruffled her hair, but inside he felt the same tugging weight. How long could he keep scraping by? She deserved more than toast and a father who came home smelling of polish and bleach. Yet it was in her smile that he found the courage to keep going. That evening, he lingered after hours, telling himself it was for the overtime pay. But really it was the painting that drew him back. The room was dim, lit only by a single lamp. Claire wasn't there, and he was almost grateful. He didn't want her to see him like this, bent over the ruined canvas, studying its wounds as though he had any right to touch something so personal. His fingers hovered above the cracked surface but didn't land. He wasn't an artist, not in the way the world defined it, but he remembered enough. His mother had taught him about pigments, about patience, about the slow restoration of what seemed lost. The thought whispered in his mind, "What if I could?" He didn't notice Claire standing in the doorway until she spoke. "You stayed." Her voice startled him, but it wasn't cold. There was curiosity threaded through it, and perhaps suspicion. He straightened, fumbling for words, but she held up her hand. "Don't explain. Just tell me, why that painting? Why does it matter to you?" Daniel hesitated, then answered honestly, "Because it matters to you. And because I know what it's like to lose something you thought you'd never lose." His voice caught at the end, his eyes betraying memories he didn't put into words. For the first time in years, Claire didn't have a ready response. She had lived in a world where people spoke to her with agendas, with motives, with fear of her authority. Yet this man, a janitor, spoke with nothing but truth. Something about his simplicity unnerved her, but it also pulled her closer. She studied him, trying to decide if he was naive, foolish, or brave. Finally, she turned her gaze to the painting. "My father taught me everything: discipline, ambition, how to build something that lasts. That portrait was the only thing that kept me tethered to him after he died. When the fire destroyed it, it felt like losing him all over again." Her voice cracked, just once, and she hated herself for it. But Daniel didn't flinch or look away. He simply stood there, as though her pain deserved to be heard rather than concealed. The silence stretched until it felt almost unbearable. But then Daniel broke it with a question that surprised them both. "What if I tried?" Claire's head snapped toward him. "Tried what?" "To bring it back." His tone was steady, though his heart pounded. He had no guarantee, no certainty, but he felt compelled to say it. Something about the challenge she had thrown at him, half mocking and half desperate, had lit a fire in him he didn't recognize. Claire should have laughed. She should have told him it was impossible, that restoration required experts, not janitors. But instead she found herself whispering, "Then surprise me." As she walked away, heels echoing down the marble hall, Daniel remained rooted to the spot, staring at the ruined painting. For the first time since he'd begun working in that mansion, he wasn't thinking about cleaning floors or surviving another week. He was thinking about color, about brushes, about what it would mean to bring a ghost back to life. And deep down, he knew, whether he succeeded or failed, nothing would ever be the same again. The following week unfolded like a tightrope walk for Daniel. Every day he carried out his usual duties, polishing the marble floors, emptying wastebaskets, straightening the sterile elegance of the Hudson mansion. Yet beneath the surface, his mind was consumed by the ruined painting. It called to him like an unfinished melody, demanding not just attention but devotion. At night, after Emma had gone to bed, he would sketch in a worn notebook he had kept since his youth. His hands, rough from years of labor, traced outlines of figures and shadows, remembering the rhythms his mother had once drilled into him when she taught him how to mix paints from nothing more than crushed leaves and powdered chalk. The skills had dulled, but the memory of them burned alive again, as though some hidden part of him had been waiting for this moment. Claire, on the other hand, found herself restless in her own home, which had always been a fortress of control. She was a woman who managed empires, silenced rooms with a glance, and rarely permitted chaos into her orbit. But Daniel had unsettled her balance. His offer to attempt the impossible lingered in her mind far more than the words of board members or shareholders. She told herself it was foolish, reckless, even insulting. But the truth was that his audacity made her feel something she had long forgotten: hope mixed with fear. She had spent years teaching herself never to need anyone. And yet she caught herself lingering near the hall where the painting rested, waiting for signs that he had begun. One evening, Claire entered the grand hall unannounced. Daniel was already there, sleeves rolled up, carefully inspecting the cracks that spread across the portrait like veins of sorrow. A small collection of brushes and jars stood neatly at his side, not professional tools, but ones he had salvaged from thrift shops and borrowed from an art supply store. He had even mixed his own pigments, crude but carefully measured. He looked out of place in the cavernous, chandelier-lit room, yet he moved with a quiet purpose that drew her in. "You really mean to do this," she said, her voice neither mocking nor soft, but balanced somewhere in between. Daniel glanced up, meeting her eyes. "I can't promise perfection, but I can promise I'll try as if it were my own." Those words unsettled her, as if it were his own. She had hired countless people who saw her estate and her wealth as untouchable symbols of power, but Daniel treated the painting as something human, fragile, worthy of care. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she crossed the room and stood near the ruined canvas, her gaze drifting over the broken colors, the fragments of her father's face that still remained. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to admit how much it hurt to look at it. Daniel began his work slowly. He didn't scrub or rush. He cleaned the surface gently, each stroke of his brush almost reverent, as though afraid to disturb the spirit within the canvas. Claire watched him in silence, her arms folded tightly, but something about the scene unsettled her further. She was not used to being an observer, not used to watching someone else take control of what mattered most, yet she couldn't look away. As the nights passed, she found excuses to wander into the hall. Sometimes she told herself she needed to review documents, sometimes that she was inspecting the staff. But the truth was, she wanted to see him work. Daniel never spoke much while restoring. Instead, his silence created a strange intimacy, as though the room itself held its breath around them. Claire would stand near the window, pretending to check her phone, when in reality her eyes followed every movement of his hands, the careful way he layered color upon color. One night, however, their silence broke. Claire asked a question she hadn't intended to voice. "Why are you doing this, Daniel? You could just collect your paycheck and move on. Why risk so much for something that isn't yours?" He paused, brush hovering over the canvas. His jaw tightened before he answered. "Because some things shouldn't stay broken, not when they mean something to someone. And because maybe I need to prove to myself that I can fix more than floors." His voice wavered, just slightly, but it carried the weight of his unspoken past, the years of loss, the death of his wife, the responsibility of raising a child alone. Claire's chest tightened, though she forced herself to remain composed. She wasn't accustomed to people speaking to her in such raw honesty. It unnerved her even more than his skill with the painting. She wanted to dismiss his words, to remind him that she hadn't asked for this, that her challenge had been reckless. But deep inside, a quiet warmth spread, one she hadn't felt since her father was alive, the feeling of being seen. By the end of the week, the painting began to change. The darkness that had overtaken it was slowly lifting. The contours of her father's features re-emerged, faint but undeniable. Claire caught her breath the first time she saw the glimmer of his eyes restored. It was as though a piece of her own soul had been returned to her, something she hadn't realized was still missing. That night, she couldn't sleep. She walked through her empty mansion, her footsteps echoing in the silence, and realized with a jolt of discomfort that Daniel's presence had begun to fill spaces she had once guarded with iron walls. He wasn't just restoring a painting. He was unsettling the life she had built, brick by careful brick. And though it terrified her, she found she didn't want him to stop. The storm outside rattled the windows of the Hudson mansion, but inside the only sound was the faint scrape of Daniel's brush against the canvas. He had been working for hours, bent over the painting with an intensity that consumed him. His movements were precise, almost surgical. Each stroke of color carefully layered, each line delicately revived from the ruin of age and neglect. Sweat gathered at his temple, not from exertion but from the pressure he placed upon himself. He knew this was more than a painting. It was Claire's heart encased in oil and canvas, a piece of her past she had dared him to resurrect. Claire had been watching from the far side of the room, leaning against the carved oak doorway. She told herself she had only come to check on progress, to ensure the task she had mockingly set was not being treated as a game. Yet as she stood there, she realized her reason was far less practical. There was something about Daniel's focus, the quiet fire in him, that drew her in. It unsettled her, but she couldn't look away. When Daniel finally paused, rolling his sore shoulders, Claire stepped closer, her heels clicking against the polished marble. The sound startled him, and he looked up, eyes sharp with the concentration of a man pulled out of deep thought. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence stretched, filled only by the steady patter of rain outside. "You've made progress," Claire said, her voice lower than she intended, almost softer. Daniel set his brush down, wiping his hands on a cloth. "It's fragile work. The canvas, it doesn't forgive mistakes." He studied her expression before adding, "Neither do people." The words hung between them, heavier than the storm. Claire narrowed her eyes, unsure if his comment was meant for her. She was a woman used to reading negotiations, contracts, lies hidden in corporate smiles. But Daniel's honesty disarmed her more than any boardroom adversary. He wasn't afraid to reveal the cracks in himself, and that unnerved her, because it made her own guarded heart ache. She stepped closer, standing just behind him now, her gaze fixed on the painting. The faint outline of her father's face was returning, his eyes nearly whole again, as if they had been waiting beneath the surface for someone to coax them back. For the first time in years, Claire felt her chest tighten with something she had suppressed. Grief, raw and unshielded. "You loved him," Daniel said quietly, almost as if he were speaking to himself. Her head snapped toward him. "What?" He didn't meet her eyes. "This isn't just art to you. You loved him. That's why you can't let it go." The words cut her open in ways she wasn't prepared for. She turned her face away, blinking quickly to dispel the sting in her eyes. Claire Hudson, the woman who had built her empire on composure and steel, could not afford to unravel before a janitor. And yet something in his tone, gentle, not accusing, made her want to. "I don't need a therapist in overalls," she said sharply, trying to regain her armor. Daniel finally met her gaze then, and for a moment Claire forgot how to breathe. His eyes held none of the judgment she feared, only quiet understanding. "I'm not trying to be one. I just know what it's like to hold on to something that feels like the last piece of someone you loved." The room went still. The thunder outside rolled across the sky, but neither of them moved. Claire opened her mouth to retort, but nothing came. She had always considered her grief private, a burden to lock away, not something to share with someone who scrubbed her floors. And yet the honesty in his words reached into her, pulling at the places she thought she had buried. She turned back to the painting, staring at her father's faint smile, and for the first time whispered something she hadn't said aloud in years. "He believed in me when no one else did." Daniel's expression softened. "Then maybe this painting isn't about him at all. Maybe it's about remembering you're still that person he believed in." Her throat tightened. She wanted to argue, to dismiss him as presumptuous, but the words stuck in her chest. For a moment, she was not the powerful CEO, not the untouchable millionaire. She was simply Claire, the daughter of a man who had once called her brave, who had believed she could change the world. Daniel picked up his brush again, his hands steady despite the storm outside. "I'll bring him back for you, not because you dared me to, but because someone like him deserves to live again, even if it's just in color and light." Claire stayed beside him long after she should have left, watching each stroke as though the painting's revival was reviving something inside her too. The storm outside raged on, But in the quiet of the grand hall, something deeper stirred, something neither of them yet dared to name. The morning light spilled through the tall, arched windows of the mansion, painting golden streaks across the marble. Far from floor, Daniel had fallen asleep in the corner of the great hall, still in his work clothes, exhaustion finally overtaking him after a night of painstakingly restoring the painting. His head rested awkwardly against the back of the chair, his arms loosely crossed, the faint smudge of paint still on his cheek. Claire entered the hall silently, her heels barely making a sound on the polished stone. For a moment, she simply watched him. It felt strange to see him in such stillness. He was usually moving with quiet determination, working as though every task carried invisible weight. Now, asleep, he looked younger, almost vulnerable, and something in her chest twisted at the sight. She turned her gaze to the canvas. The transformation was undeniable. Her father's face was taking shape with clarity that almost startled her. His eyes, once faded and dull, now seemed to hold a faint glimmer of life. Claire's breath caught. She had not seen those eyes in years, and suddenly the mansion no longer felt like a fortress of marble and glass. It felt like home again, in the briefest, most fragile way. The sound of movement pulled her back. Daniel stirred awake, blinking rapidly, confusion clouding his eyes before recognition settled in. He straightened quickly, embarrassed to have been caught asleep in the home of a woman like her. I must have dozed off, he said, rubbing the back of his neck. Claire tilted her head. Her usual stern expression softened just slightly. You worked through the night, didn't you? He hesitated, then gave a small shrug. It needed more time. I didn't want to stop halfway. There was something about the simplicity of his words that unsettled her. People in her world always spoke with angles, with motives sharpened like knives. Daniel spoke with none. She sat down across from him, her posture straight but her voice quieter than usual. You're not doing this just for me, are you? His eyes met hers, steady and unflinching. Number, I'm doing it because I know what it means to hold on to something you've lost. This isn't about money or your challenge. It's about not letting someone disappear. Claire's chest tightened. For the first time, she felt the urge to ask, not as the CEO who demanded results, but as a woman searching for connection. Who did you lose, Daniel? The question seemed to weigh on him. He looked away, his jaw tightening, his hands curling into fists in his lap. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost rough. My wife, 5 years ago. Cancer. She was gone before we even had time to fight it. His throat worked as though the words were harder than any labor he had ever done. Since then, it's just been me and my son. Everything I do, every hour I work, it's for him. The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't heavy with tension, but with something deeper, something raw. Claire felt her own defenses falter, piece by piece. She had built her empire on strength, on never letting anyone see the cracks. Yet here was a man who carried scars deeper than most, and he spoke of them without pretense. It was unsettling, but also liberating. I didn't know, she said softly. Her voice lacked its usual polish, stripped bare of the armor she wore around everyone else. Daniel gave a faint, almost weary smile. Most people don't ask. They just see the uniform, the mop, the paycheck. They don't see the story behind it. Her eyes lingered on him, searching. For so long she had seen her staff as background, people who existed only to make the gears of her empire run smoothly. Yet Daniel's presence was rewriting everything she thought she knew. He wasn't just a man with calloused hands and a quiet voice. He was someone who carried pain, hope, and a resilience she could not ignore. Her gaze shifted back to the painting. You've brought him back, she whispered, her voice catching. My father, his face looks alive again. Daniel studied the canvas too, his eyes thoughtful. I haven't brought him back yet, but I will. He looked at her then, his expression unwavering. Not because you promised me something, because you need this. You need to remember who you were when he was still here. The words hit her harder than she wanted to admit. She blinked, swallowing against the emotion rising in her throat. She wanted to tell him he was wrong, that she didn't need anyone, not even her father's memory to validate her. But deep down, she knew he was right. She had buried herself in power, in money, in the image of invincibility, because it was easier than facing the hollow ache left behind. Claire stood abruptly, needing space. needing distance from the man who could unravel her with such simple truths. Yet as she turned, she found herself pausing, her hand resting on the back of the chair. Without looking at him, she said almost reluctantly, "You're not like anyone I've ever met, Daniel." He didn't smile, didn't gloat. He simply replied, "Maybe that's because you've only been looking in the wrong places." Her heart stumbled at the quiet conviction in his tone. For the first time in years, Claire Hudson felt something she couldn't categorize, couldn't control, and it terrified her. Outside, the storm had passed and sunlight broke across the sky. But inside the mansion, a different storm had begun, one that neither of them could stop. The rain had left the world outside washed clean, but inside the mansion, the air was heavy with something far more complicated than weather. Claire had spent most of the day locked in her office, staring at contracts and numbers that usually grounded her, but her mind kept drifting back to the man who slept on her marble floor the night before. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw him bent over the canvas, his hands steady despite fatigue, his expression carrying both pain and purpose. She hated that she could not stop thinking about him, hated that the walls she had built so carefully around herself now had cracks wide enough for him to slip through. By late evening, she forced herself to return to the grand hall. The painting stood in the same place, lit by the soft glow of the chandelier. It was different again, more defined, more alive. Her father's features had sharpened, and the warm depth in his eyes was nearly finished. Claire stood frozen, breath caught, the ache in her chest twisting deeper than ever. She could almost hear his voice again, almost imagine him standing there, telling her she was capable of more than wealth and empire. Daniel was there too, of course. He was crouched near the base of the canvas, carefully mixing pigments with the precision of a surgeon. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing forearms dusted with faint traces of paint. The concentration on his face was absolute, and for a moment Claire simply watched him, unnoticed, her pulse quickening at the thought of how intimately he worked with something she considered sacred. Finally, she cleared her throat. The sound startled him slightly, and he glanced up, his dark eyes meeting hers. "You came back," he said, voice low but steady. "I live here," she replied, a little too sharply, before softening. "But yes, I came to see what you've done." He gestured to the canvas, his movements unhurried. "It's close. Another night, maybe two, and it'll be whole again." Her lips parted, but no words came immediately. She walked closer, heels clicking on marble, until she stood just a few feet from him. The painting radiated something uncanny, something that tugged at her heart. She wanted to thank him, but gratitude was foreign to her. It tasted like vulnerability. Instead, she asked, "Why do you care so much?" "This isn't your father. This isn't your loss." Daniel leaned back on his heels, looking up at her with that same unsettling calm. "Because loss is loss, Claire. It doesn't matter whose. When you've carried it yourself, you recognize it in others. And I see it in your eyes every time you look at this painting." She bristled instinctively, wanting to deny it, but the truth was like a mirror she couldn't escape. Her throat tightened. "You think you know me," she said quietly, almost bitterly. "I don't pretend to know you," he answered, standing now, wiping his hands on a rag. He was taller than she remembered, and standing this close, she noticed how his presence filled the space. Not with arrogance, but with quiet strength. "But I see you, and maybe that's something no one else bothers to do." Those words unsettled her more than anything he had said before. People saw her all the time. Photographers, investors, rivals. But they saw the image she curated. The flawless CEO who commanded boardrooms and headlines. Daniel was claiming to see something beneath that. Something real. She wanted to laugh, to brush it off, but instead she felt her defenses crumbling under the weight of his gaze. She turned away abruptly, pacing to the window where the rain still trickled down in silver threads. "You talk as if you've figured everything out, as if pain makes you wiser." "It doesn't," he said simply. "It just makes you honest. You stop wasting time pretending everything is fine. You stop lying to yourself about what really matters." His words cut through her like a blade, because deep down she knew she had been lying to herself for years, about the hollow satisfaction of her success, about the loneliness she carried into every boardroom and banquet. She gripped the window frame tightly, forcing composure, but her reflection betrayed her. She looked tired. She looked human. Behind her, Daniel's voice softened. "You don't have to keep fighting alone." She spun around at that, her eyes flashing, anger mixing with fear. And what would you know about fighting alone? You don't know the weight of running an empire, of having thousands depend on you. He didn't flinch. His reply was quiet but firm. No, I don't run an empire. I raise a son by myself. Every night I wonder if I'll make enough to keep a roof over his head. Every morning I worry if I'll live long enough to see him grow. That's my empire. That's my fight. And I'd argue it's just as heavy as yours. Her chest constricted. The room seemed too small, too charged with unspoken truths. She wanted to tell him he was wrong, that their worlds were incomparable, but instead she saw the rawness in his face, the grief buried in his voice, and her heart betrayed her with a sudden, aching pull. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence was thick, broken only by the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Then Claire whispered, almost against her will, "You're infuriating." Daniel's lips curved into the smallest hint of a smile. "So I've been told." The tension in the air shifted, not lighter but sharper, like the edge of something dangerous, something alive. Claire's pulse hammered in her ears as she realized how close they stood, how little space remained between them. She wanted to step back, to retreat into the safety of her walls, but instead she stayed rooted, caught in the storm of his presence. The painting loomed beside them, her father's gaze watching silently from the canvas, as if he too sensed the shift. For the first time in years, Claire felt something stirring within her that had nothing to do with wealth, power, or loss. It was fragile, terrifying, and impossible to ignore. And as Daniel lowered his gaze back to the painting, she knew with bone-deep certainty that her life would never return to what it had been before he walked into her mansion. The storm outside had passed, but inside the mansion, the tension was heavier than ever. Claire barely slept after their last conversation, Daniel's words circling her mind with relentless persistence. She had built her life on certainties, profits, strategies, control. But now all of it seemed fragile, like glass threatening to shatter beneath the weight of something she couldn't define. And it wasn't just about the painting anymore. It was about him, about the way his presence disrupted the carefully ordered rhythm of her existence. The following evening, she descended the wide staircase slowly, each step echoing like a drumbeat in the vast hall. She wore no armor tonight, no crisp suit, no carefully selected jewelry. Instead, a simple blouse and trousers, as though she couldn't summon the energy to dress as the indomitable CEO. When she entered the grand hall, Daniel was already there, standing before the canvas, but not painting. His hands rested on his hips, and his brow was furrowed as though deep in thought. She stopped at the edge of the room, studying him, the way his shoulders carried quiet strength, the way the faint light carved shadows along his face. He didn't belong here, not in this palace of marble and chandeliers, and yet, he belonged more than anyone she had ever invited inside. "Why aren't you working?" she asked softly, her voice carrying through the space. Daniel turned, startled slightly, as if pulled from a trance. "It's nearly done, but it's not just about the paint anymore. There's something missing, and I can't force it." Claire walked closer, drawn as if by invisible gravity. She stopped in front of the canvas, her breath catching. The portrait was almost whole now, the eyes alive, the contours so vivid it felt as though her father might step out of the frame. A tremor of grief and awe surged through her, leaving her unsteady. It's him," she whispered. "It feels like him." Daniel's gaze lingered on her as she spoke, and she felt it before she saw it. The weight of his eyes not on the painting, but on her. Heat rose in her chest, not from embarrassment, but from something far deeper, something that left her exposed. She turned toward him, trying to hide the sudden vulnerability. "You've done more than I thought possible. You've kept your word." He shook his head slightly. "Number, I've done what anyone could do if they cared enough." He paused, his expression hardening with sincerity. "But you're the one who gave me the chance. You let me try." Claire's laugh was soft, almost bitter. "I didn't let you. I doubted you every step of the way. I told myself this was foolish, that you couldn't possibly succeed. I wanted to prove myself right. And yet," Daniel said quietly, stepping closer, "you kept coming back. Every night, watching, hoping, even if you wouldn't admit it. You wanted me to succeed as much as I did." She opened her mouth to deny it, but the truth burned too brightly in her chest. Her defenses crumbled as her voice came out weaker than she intended. Maybe I did. Silence stretched between them, heavy and electric. She could hear the faint ticking of the clock, the whisper of wind against the windows, the rhythm of her own heart beating too fast. Daniel closed the distance between them until they stood only a breath apart. His presence consumed her senses. The warmth radiating from him, the faint scent of paint and soap, the steadiness of his gaze that stripped away everything she tried to hide. "You asked me once why I cared," he said, his voice low and steady. "The truth is, I care because I see you drowning in loneliness. And I know what that feels like. But I also know what it feels like to fight against it. You don't have to keep carrying this alone, Claire." Her chest tightened painfully, tears stinging the corners of her eyes before she could stop them. No one had ever said those words to her, not in all the years of her relentless climb to the top. People admired her, feared her, envied her, but no one had ever offered to carry her loneliness. Her voice broke as she whispered, "You don't know what you're saying. You don't know what it would mean." "I know exactly what it would mean," Daniel answered firmly. "It would mean stepping into your world even when I don't belong there. It would mean risking everything I've built with my son. But I'd do it. For you. Because for the first time since I lost everything, I want to fight for someone else again." Her breath hitched, the walls she had lived behind for years collapsing in a single, shattering moment. She reached out without thinking, her hand brushing against his. The contact sent a shock through her, not of fear but of recognition, as if her soul had been waiting for this touch. Daniel's fingers closed gently around hers, steady and unyielding. He didn't pull her closer, didn't rush. He simply held her, giving her the choice. And for the first time in her life, she chose not power, not control, but surrender. She stepped forward, letting the space between them vanish, her body pressing lightly against his. His hand came up to her cheek, rough and warm, tilting her face toward his. Their eyes locked, hers shimmering with unshed tears, his burning with an intensity that left her trembling. And then finally his lips met hers. The kiss was not soft. It was fierce, desperate, a collision of grief and longing, and something terrifyingly real. Claire clung to him as though she had been waiting her entire life for this moment, her heart racing with the terrifying realization that she was no longer untouchable, no longer untouchably alone. When they broke apart, breathless, Claire pressed her forehead against his. "You've ruined everything," she whispered, though her voice was trembling with something dangerously close to joy. Daniel smiled faintly, his thumb brushing her cheek. "Maybe I've just started something new." The painting loomed behind them, nearly alive, her father's eyes seeming to watch with approval. For the first time in years, Claire felt not just alive, but free. The morning of the unveiling arrived with a silence that felt heavy and full of meaning. The mansion's halls, usually echoing with the shuffle of staff or the measured stride of Claire's presence, seemed to hold their breath. For weeks, Daniel had poured every ounce of his strength, skill, and heart into resurrecting the painting, and now it stood complete. Covered with a velvet drape, it leaned against the easel in the grand hall, waiting for the moment when the truth would be revealed. But more than the painting was at stake, their futures were wound into it, like threads too tightly bound to ever separate again. Claire had arranged for a small gathering, a few board members, art curators, and trusted colleagues who had doubted her decision to commission something so audacious from a man they considered unworthy of the task. She wanted them to see what Daniel had achieved, to see what she had chosen to believe in, even if she couldn't quite admit that her faith had been shaky at times. As the guests filed in, murmurs filled the hall. They admired the mansion, whispered about Claire's boldness, speculated on whether the long-lost painting could truly be revived. Claire stood at the center, wearing a white suit that gleamed under the chandelier's light, her expression cool and composed, but her hands trembled faintly at her sides. No one noticed, except Daniel. He stood off to the side in simple clothes, no more polished than the man she had first met with a mop in hand. And yet, there was something different about him now. He carried himself taller with quiet certainty. His eyes met hers across the hall, and she felt steadied, as if the storm inside her could calm simply by his presence. When the room settled, Claire's voice cut through the murmurs, clear and commanding. "Many of you doubted this. Many of you thought it reckless, impossible. And perhaps I would have agreed, had I not seen with my own eyes what determination and vision can accomplish when combined with heart." Her eyes flicked toward Daniel, and though the crowd didn't notice, he did. She gestured to the painting. Today I ask you to look not just at a restored piece of art, but at a miracle born from persistence, pain, and faith. With that, she nodded to Daniel. He stepped forward, his fingers brushing the velvet drape. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to pause. Then with one steady pull, the cloth fell away. Gasps rippled through the room. Before them stood the painting, alive in color, its brilliance somehow greater than memory could have preserved. The figure in the portrait, Claire's father, looked out with eyes so piercing and warm, it felt as though he were present again, watching over them. The lines were tender but powerful, each stroke filled with reverence, as if Daniel had painted not just a face, but a soul. One of the curators pressed a hand to his mouth. This is impossible. It's not just restored, it's reborn. Another guest whispered, it's as if the artist himself returned to finish it. Claire's throat tightened. Her eyes burned, and she didn't care if anyone saw. She reached out and touched the edge of the frame with trembling fingers. Father, she breathed, barely audible. But Daniel heard. Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then swelling as people rose to their feet, unable to deny the truth before them. Yet amid the noise, Claire only saw Daniel, standing humbly, his head slightly bowed, as though he couldn't quite accept their praise. She crossed the floor to him. Without hesitation, she took his hand in hers. The crowd fell into stunned silence. For the first time, Claire did not care about appearances, about expectations, about the armor she had worn for so many years. This man, she said, her voice steady, though her heart raced, was dismissed as nothing more than a janitor, a single father overlooked, underestimated, and yet he has done what none of you believed could be done. He has given me back a piece of my family. He has given me back hope. The words shocked even her as they left her lips, but they were true. She turned to Daniel, her eyes softening. And I owe him more than gratitude. I owe him a chance, a place in my life. The guests exchanged bewildered glances, whispers swirling through the room, but Daniel only looked at her, his hand tightening around hers. For once, he didn't look away, didn't retreat. You don't owe me anything, Claire, he said quietly. But if you want me in your life, I'll be there. For you. For as long as you'll have me. Her chest ached, but this time, it was with something that felt dangerously close to joy. For the first time in years, the emptiness inside her was filled with warmth, with possibility, with love. The applause rose again, but Claire no longer heard it. She pulled Daniel closer, not caring for the shock in her audience's eyes. Her lips brushed against his, a kiss not fierce like before, but steady, unshakable, a promise sealed in front of the world. The painting stood behind them, her father's gaze watching over the moment, and Claire felt with startling certainty that he approved. For the first time in her life, the woman who had everything except happiness realized she no longer needed to chase power to feel whole. She had found something rarer, something richer, something that no empire could buy. She had found love, shocking, undeserved, miraculous love, where she least expected it. And she knew she would never let it go. In the end, this tale is not only about the improbable bond between a billionaire CEO and a humble janitor, but also about the ways in which art, faith, and resilience can heal broken parts of the soul. The painting became a metaphor for both of them, damaged, forgotten, yet still holding beauty that could be restored with patience and courage. For me, the most powerful message lies in the realization that true worth does not come from wealth, titles, or social status, but from the ability to see life, value, and hope where others see nothing but ruin. This story reminds us that miracles often happen not when people of equal worlds collide, but when opposites meet and dare to trust one another. It's a shock wrapped in tenderness, a fairy tale set in the harshness of reality, proving that even the most unlikely people can rewrite each other's destinies.